Pay attention to the man ringing the doorbell in this Ring camera footage. That's 67-year-old Derek Martin, arriving at the Bashford family home in New Haven, East Sussex. Chloe Bashford, 33, opens the door, unaware that her stepfather is about to turn this afternoon deadly. What the camera doesn't show is what happens next. Minutes later, Martin attacks Chloe with a hammer and knife, killing her. Her husband Josh arrives home moments later, and he too is murdered. Their 2 children are just minutes away, walking home from school, oblivious to the horror inside. Security footage shows Martin frantically cleaning, ripping the Ring camera off the wall and fleeing. Soon, a courtroom will decide his fate, and everyone will wait to see the sentence for this shocking double murder. January 19th, 2023, 6:50 p.m. Derek Martin walks into a police station in Peacehaven, East Sussex, and speaks 7 words that would begin one of the most disturbing murder investigations in recent memory.
What's going on?
No call to emergency services, no attempt to flee, just a calm surrender and a chilling admission that would shatter 2 families forever. But this wasn't a stranger walking in off the street. This was someone the victims knew intimately, someone they trusted completely.
Chloe Bashford was 30 when she died, and Joshua Bashford was 33. They were married and lived together in New Haven. There were 4 children in the family. At the time of their parents' deaths, they were aged 15, 12, 7, and 4.
4 kids would never see their parents again. But here's where this case takes an even darker turn. Derek Martin wasn't some random intruder. He wasn't a burglar caught in the act or a stranger with a vendetta. He had known Chloe since the day she was born.
You had known Chloe since she was a baby. She is the daughter of your former wife, Elaine Sturgis. You knew the Bashford family well. You had become close to them, and you spent a lot of time with Chloe and the children.
Martin was Chloe's stepfather figure. He'd been married to her mother, Elaine Sturgis, and remained part of the family's life even after their divorce. He wasn't just accepted into the Bashford home, he was woven into the fabric of their daily routine. The didn't see him as a distant family acquaintance.
One of the described you as like a granddad, and said you and his mum got on well, and you would joke together.
Like a granddad. Those 3 words reveal everything about the level of trust this family placed in Derek Martin. He wasn't an outsider, he was family. This wasn't just some random double homicide. This was a complete betrayal of trust by someone who should have been protecting these children, not destroying their world. January 19th, 2023. Derek Martin drove through the quiet streets of Peacehaven, East Sussex, heading toward his usual stop, Costa Coffee. The surveillance cameras captured him entering at his typical time, following a routine so familiar it had become almost automatic. This was a ritual. Martin would buy Chloe her usual coffee, just as he'd done countless mornings before. He arrived at the Bashford family home in time to help with the morning chaos, getting the younger ready, preparing for the school run. Everything moved like clockwork.
You bought Chloe a coffee from Costa Coffee, as you often did, before arriving at the Bashford family home, in time to drive Chloe and the younger children to school.
Where the coffee, the drive to school, the small talk, the domesticity of it all created a veneer of absolute normalcy. These were the mundane moments that defined their relationship. A grandfather figure helping with the daily grind of family life. Security footage shows Martin and Chloe together at Costa that morning. They met, they talked, they shared breakfast. Nothing about their interaction suggested anything unusual. To anyone watching, this was just another Thursday. After school drop-off, Martin and Chloe returned to the Bashford home on Bramber Drive. The surveillance timestamps marked their movements with clinical precision. Every second documented, every action recorded. The older children were at school. Joshua was at work. The house, normally filled with the noise of 4 kids, sat quiet. 12:16 p.m. That's the timestamp when everything changed. When the grandfather figure who'd bought coffee and helped with the school run became something else entirely. What happened in those next minutes would leave 4 orphaned and 2 families destroyed forever. Because that's when Derek Martin picked up the hammer. The time is 12:16 p.m.
Then shortly after 12:16 p.m. that day, you launched a ferocious attack on Chloe. You hit her on the head with a hammer, doing so multiple times, whilst she was no doubt incapacitated by the blows to her head.
Multiple blows to Chloe's head, the weapon that should have been in a toolbox. Used for repairs around the house she trusted him to help maintain. The betrayal was physical, immediate, and devastating. But Martin didn't stop.
You put down the hammer and took a knife from the kitchen and stabbed her 8 times. 5 times to her upper back and 3 times to her abdomen.
He put down the hammer, walked to the kitchen, selected a knife, and returned to where Chloe lay. 8 stab wounds total, 5 to her upper back as she likely tried to crawl away or shield herself, 3 to her abdomen. This wasn't a moment of rage that passed. This was sustained, determined violence. The house that had been filled with the sounds of family life, children laughing, breakfast being made, the ordinary chaos of a household with 4 kids, fell silent except for the horror unfolding inside. Joshua Bashford arrived home around 1 p.m. He had no warning, no reason to expect anything other than the normal afternoon he'd left behind that morning. What happened next would add a second victim to Martin's rampage.
You chased Joshua upstairs, slashing his back with a knife. Then in the master bedroom, you stabbed him 4 times to the front of his body. One of the stab wounds penetrated to a depth of 12 centimeters.
Joshua ran, tried to escape up the stairs, Martin pursuing with the knife, a slash across his back. Then in the master bedroom, the room where Joshua and Chloe should have been safe, where they'd slept together, where they'd planned their life with their 4 children, Martin stabbed Joshua 4 times in the front of his body, 4 stab wounds. But Martin still wasn't finished.
As he was dying from the stab wounds, you put down the knife, took up a rope, and strangled him. The cause of Joshua's death was stab wounds and compression of the neck.
As Joshua lay dying from the knife wounds, Martin put down the blade. He picked up a rope, and he strangled him. The medical examiner would later confirm dual causes of death, the stab wounds and compression of the neck. Martin had made absolutely certain 2 people who trusted him, 2 people who'd welcomed him into their home, into their children's lives, into the intimate fabric of their daily routine, dead within an hour of that morning coffee run. The violence was over by early afternoon. The house on Bramber Drive sat quiet again. But inside were 2 bodies and the evidence of what Derek Martin had done to people who'd called him family.
After the fatal attacks, you cleaned up the knife and some of the bloodstains. You took the door handles off the doors of the rooms where the bodies were. You later explained that this was to ensure the children could not see what had happened to their parents.
He wiped down the knife. He tried to remove some of the bloodstains. Most significantly, he removed the door handles from the rooms where Chloe and Joshua's bodies lay, a deliberate act to prevent the children from walking into the nightmare he'd created. Because the children would be coming home from school soon, and Martin had to figure out what to do next. The house sat silent, 2 bodies inside, blood pooling on floors where children normally played, and Derek Martin, the family friend, the grandfather figure, the murderer, began cleaning up. What happened in those following hours reveals something deeply disturbing about human psychology, the ability to compartmentalize violence and normalcy simultaneously. The surveillance footage is surreal. Martin sitting at Costa with the children, just hours after murdering their parents, acting as their caregiver, buying them drinks, going through the motions of normalcy as if this were just another afternoon, then McDonald's. Watch him at the self-service kiosk. The children's faces blurred for protection, but Martin's visible, placing orders, navigating the menu, doing what any guardian would do on a normal day, except their parents were dead at home, and he'd killed them. The banality of it is chilling. Fast food and coffee shops, routine errands with children who had no idea their world had just ended. But Martin hadn't just been playing guardian. The surveillance captured something else. Chloe's mobile phone, discarded into bushes, evidence he thought would disappear, evidence that would later help police construct the timeline and solidify the case against him. Eventually, Martin took the children to their grandmother, Elaine Sturgis, his ex-wife, Chloe's mother, the woman who'd brought him into this family's life decades ago. He left the children there, safe but unaware of what awaited them. Then Derek Martin walked to the police station. 6:50 p.m., less than 7 hours after the murders. He approached the desk and confessed. No lawyer present, no attempt to negotiate or deflect, just those 7 words that started this entire investigation.
What's going on? 2 people dead. 2 people dead.
The officers who heard those words immediately shifted into protocol. Martin wasn't a witness anymore. He was a suspect, then a defendant.
7/12. Okay, you're under arrest on the suspicion of murder ×2. You don't have to say anything. However, may harm defence if you do not mention when questions and that we should later align in court. Anything you do say.
Watch Martin during the arrest. No resistance, no emotion, just passive acceptance of what he'd set in motion by walking through those doors. but the fundamental question remained. How does someone murder 2 people, then spend the afternoon buying their children chicken nuggets? The answer wouldn't come from surveillance cameras or confession recordings. It would come from a courtroom where a jury would examine not just what Derek Martin did, but why, and whether his mind could bear full responsibility for destroying an entire family. January 20th, 2023. Derek Martin sat in a police interview room just hours after walking into that station and confessing. The investigation had begun with 7 words. Now came the harder question. Why? The murders themselves weren't in dispute. Martin admitted everything, but the law required understanding not just what he did, but his state of mind when he did it. His defense team entered a plea: not guilty to murder, guilty to manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility.
In August 2023, you pleaded not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility. This is a partial defense to the charge of murder.
This wasn't a technicality. It was a fundamental legal principle. If mental illness substantially impaired Martin's ability to understand his actions or exercise self-control, the law recognized a reduced culpability. Murder becomes manslaughter. Life imprisonment remains, but the sentence reflects diminished responsibility. The prosecution would have to prove Martin was fully in control. The defense would argue his depression made him incapable of bearing complete responsibility for what he'd done to Chloe and Joshua. Both sides brought psychiatric experts. And remarkably, those experts agreed on the baseline diagnosis. Martin suffered from recurrent depressive disorder. At the time he picked up that hammer, he was experiencing a depressive episode, mild to moderate in severity.
Dr. Cumming and Professor Faisal told the court that your case is particularly complex. All the psychiatrists agreed that you have a recurrent depressive disorder, and you were suffering from mild to moderate depression at the time of the killings.
The psychiatrists didn't dispute the medical facts. Depression was real. The disorder was documented. The episode was active during the murders. But depression doesn't automatically equal diminished responsibility. The legal threshold is higher. Did that depression substantially impair his ability to understand his actions, to control his behavior? The prosecution brought their own expert, Professor Blackwood. His testimony would prove critical. Professor Blackwood testified that while Martin's depression was real, something else drove those attacks. The psychiatric evaluation revealed gaps, inconsistencies. Martin hadn't fully explained himself even to the doctors trying to understand his mental state. The professor's conclusion was stark. Martin's precise motivation remained known only to Martin himself. The courtroom heard about Martin's relationship with Chloe, the decades of connection through his ex-wife, the grandfather role he'd played, the trust the family had placed in him, and somewhere in that relationship, something had gone wrong. But what? Even the psychiatric experts couldn't definitively say. Martin hadn't articulated a clear motive. He'd confessed to the acts but hadn't explained the fury behind them. The prosecution argued this was crucial. If Martin couldn't or wouldn't explain why he murdered 2 people he'd known for years, how could the jury conclude his depression made him incapable of understanding his actions? The defense countered with the evidence of his mental state. The depression wasn't an excuse. It was a medical reality that affected his judgment, his emotional regulation, his ability to process and control his rage. But then came the prosecution's most powerful argument: Martin's behavior after the murders. He cleaned up, removed door handles, protected the children from discovering the bodies, took those children to Costa, to McDonald's, maintained a facade of normalcy for hours, then voluntarily walked into a police station and confessed. Those actions demonstrated awareness, planning, understanding of right and wrong, control over his behavior even in the aftermath of extreme violence. If depression had truly overwhelmed his capacity for rational thought and self-control, would he have been capable of such calculated post-offense conduct? The judge would ultimately conclude that the attacks were driven by rage and resentment, not solely by mental illness.
And caused you to fatally assault 2 adults using different weapons. Your attacks were driven by rage and resentment.
Rage and resentment. Those are emotions, not symptoms. They suggest motive, even if Martin never fully articulated what that motive was. They suggest he understood who he was attacking and why, even if the why remained locked inside his own mind. The jury received their instructions. They had to decide, did Derek Martin's mental illness substantially impair his responsibility for these murders? All the psychiatric evidence, all the testimony about his depression, all the explanations about his mental state at the time, weighed against the brutality of the attacks, the multiple weapons, the sustained violence, the calculated aftermath, the hours spent with the children, the voluntary confession. The jury deliberated, and then they reached their verdict.
By their verdicts, the jury rejected the partial defense of diminished responsibility as available to you, and considered you should bear full responsibility for your actions.
Rejected. The partial defense of diminished responsibility, rejected. The jury concluded Derek Martin should bear full responsibility for his actions. His depression existed, but it hadn't substantially impaired his culpability for murdering Chloe and Joshua Bashford. Not manslaughter, murder. 2 counts. The legal battle was over. Martin's mental illness would be considered during sentencing, but it wouldn't shield him from the full weight of what he'd done. The law had determined he was responsible, fully, completely responsible, for destroying that family. Chloe and Joshua were dead. 4 children were orphaned, and Derek Martin would face the consequences as someone who'd understood his actions, even if he couldn't or wouldn't explain why he'd taken them. The courtroom had heard the psychiatric evidence. The judge had weighed the legal arguments. The jury had made their decision. Only one thing remained: the sentence. The jury had spoken. Derek Martin bore full responsibility for murdering Chloe and Joshua Bashford. Now came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the sentence that would determine the rest of Martin's life. But first, the law required explanation.
There is only one sentence for murder, and that is imprisonment for life. I must also state the minimum amount of time you should serve before the parole board can first consider your release.
The structure was fixed. Life imprisonment was mandatory. The question wasn't whether Martin would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He would. The question was the minimum term before he could even be considered for parole. The judge had to calculate that term using a framework that balanced aggravating factors against mitigating ones. The law demanded precision. Mathematics applied to human tragedy. And the aggravating factors were severe. Multiple weapons. That alone told the story of escalation and sustained intent. Martin hadn't simply lost control in a single moment of violence. He'd picked up a hammer, put it down, retrieved a knife, put that down, found rope. Each weapon represented a choice, a continuation of violence when he could have stopped.
You used multiple weapons in your assaults. Chloe was hit first with a hammer. Then while she was still alive, you stabbed her with a knife. You stabbed Joshua. Then whilst he was still alive, you switched to a ligature, which you used to strangle him.
The specificity was damning. Chloe was hit with a hammer while conscious, then 8 times while still alive. Joshua chased, slashed, stabbed 4 times, then strangled with rope as he died from the stab wounds. This wasn't momentary rage. This was sustained, calculated brutality against 2 separate victims. The court had to acknowledge that reality. 2 murders, not 1. Multiple weapons, sustained attacks, victims who trusted Martin completely and had that trust violated in the most horrific way imaginable. But the law also required considering factors that might reduce culpability.
I consider your culpability is reduced to a limited extent, because at the time you were suffering from a depressive episode, the effects of which were exacerbated by your personality difficulties.
Limited reduction. The judge's words were precise. Martin's depression and personality difficulties reduced his culpability to a limited extent, not substantially, not enough to support the diminished responsibility defense the jury had rejected, but enough to acknowledge that his mental state had played some role. The other mitigating factor was more straightforward: Martin's voluntary surrender. He'd walked into that police station, confessed, cooperated with the investigation. Those actions carried weight in the calculus of sentencing. The courtroom was silent as the judge worked through the framework. The starting point for a murder involving a knife was 25 years, but Martin's case involved 2 victims, multiple weapons, and sustained attacks. The aggravating factors pushed the minimum term upward, then the mitigating factors pulled it back down, but only slightly. The mathematics of justice, adding years for brutality, subtracting months for mental illness and cooperation, calculating a number that could never restore what was lost but had to somehow acknowledge the severity of what Martin had done. Throughout all of this, Martin stood.
Derek Martin, please stand up. The sentence for murder is fixed by law. This means that there is only one sentence I can pass.
No visible emotion, no tears, no collapse. Just standing there as the judge prepared to deliver the number that would define the remainder of his existence. The courtroom watched him. Chloe and Joshua's families watched him. The families whose lives he'd destroyed, whose children he'd orphaned, whose futures he'd shattered. They all watched Derek Martin stand in silence as the judge prepared to pronounce sentence. And then came the declaration.
The minimum term will be 29 years, reduced by 878 days to reflect the days you have spent on remand in custody, to a minimum term of 26 years, 7 months, and 7 days.
Well, 29 years, reduced by 878 days, the time Martin had already served on remand. The final calculation, 26 years, 7 months, and 7 days. Martin would be in his 80s before he could even apply for parole, before a board could consider whether he'd served enough time for murdering 2 people in their own home, orphaning 4 children, and destroying an entire family. 26 years, 7 months, 7 days. And the sentence was severe, among the longest minimum terms handed down for domestic murders. The judge had considered everything: the brutality, the weapons, the sustained nature of the attacks, the 2 victims. And she'd concluded that Martin needed to spend nearly 3 decades behind bars before anyone could even consider whether he'd paid enough for what he'd done. But many would argue that the severity wasn't adequacy. No sentence could bring Chloe and Joshua back. No prison term could undo the trauma inflicted on 4 children who'd lost their parents in a single afternoon. No years behind bars could restore what Martin had stolen from an entire extended family. The courtroom knew it. The families knew it. Even Martin, standing there in silence, had to know it. The sentence was delivered. Martin showed no reaction. He'd confessed, been convicted, and now been sentenced. The legal process was complete. That image would become the final visual record of Derek Martin, the family friend, the grandfather figure, the double murderer, convicted, sentenced, removed from society for at least 26 years, 7 months, and 7 days.